Welcome to Noble Warrior. My name is CK Lin. Noble Warriors want to interview thought leaders about their journey from being a burnout overachiever to reclaiming their deep joy and purpose so we can learn from them and do the same. My next guest is an associate professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. He is also a yoga practitioner for the last 50 years. He's a yoga researcher since 2001. He's the director of yoga research for the Yoga Alliance and the Kundalini Research Institute. His current studies include clinical trials of yoga for PTSD and chronic stress and burnout. Please welcome Professor Sabir Khalsa.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. I so appreciate the breathing practice that we did before we start rolling the camera. So one thing I did notice is you said that you've been a yoga practitioner for the last 50 years, and that in itself is an accomplishment. What have you observed for the coming and going of the yoga trends in the last 50 years?
Well, it's been interesting to see the change over time. One of the remarkable things is just the shift in the popularity of specific traditions and the actual leadership of spiritual masters, which has shifted and changed over time. Many of the spiritual masters, the yoga masters that were around in the late 60s and early 70s have now pretty much passed away. And so now we have a whole new um, group of leaders, many of them in India. And it's been interesting to watch that shift. It's been interesting to watch the shift in the types of yoga that's been practiced and the popularity of yoga has been really one of the most remarkable things because that has been growing exponentially over the past couple of decades, and that's really remarkable to see. We just saw a survey that was published out of the University of Michigan of the elderly talking about, have you ever practiced yoga? And that represented 24% of the elderly population, which is really a staggering a number.
24%. I mean, my perspective is yoga has definitely gone mainstream. I think in some of your research presentations that you've given, you've cited Time magazine covers and sort of the regular perception in media. I think at the time it was Desperate Housewives that you
Yes.
cited. Yeah, Yvonne, whatever the actress was. Um, what what are you most excited about these days about the what's popular in the yoga world?
Well, I'm starting to see the implementation of yoga into mainstream society in a way that it never was before. I mean, this increase in the popularity is happening at the grassroots level in the general population. So we have federal surveys that have shown, the most recent one in 2017, that 15% of the population had practiced yoga within the past year. So we're waiting on the 2022 survey results, but that increase in popularity has been at the grassroots level. But what we're starting to see now is sort of the transformation of yoga from that grassroots level into mainstream society. And when I refer to mainstream society, I'm talking about mainstream society's institutions, the public schools, the workplace, and the healthcare system. And we're starting to see that implementation happen. And that goes along with research that's showing that yoga has benefit for those particular populations and medical conditions.
Well, that's interesting. So for you, mainstream is workplace, schools. That's as simple as
The
it as
real
it
world,
may be
yeah.
here.
When you walk outside, I mean, that's what you see and where you go. It's in the gyms, it's in your schools, it's at your workplace, it's mainstream. It's right there on the street on the street corner.
Mm. What do you think is the barrier of more adaptation of going mainstream?
I think I think one of the problems is the perception of what yoga is. And that's been colored and tainted in sort of a negative way with respect to what the media shows, because most people will, associate anything with what they've seen in the media, whether it's a newspaper article or magazine cover or a news story on television. And, the media wants to portray something that's going to draw viewers.
Hmm.
And, just someone sitting there with their eyes closed, just some guy with ordinary clothes, just sitting closed eyes, doesn't look very photogenic. So what we see when yoga is talked about is one of the impossible yoga postures.
Hmm.
It's very acrobatic, that very few people can perform. And then, of course, it's a woman, a very svelte woman with, marginal clothing on. And that's what draws readers. And so
Hmm.
that's what the media puts out. And the yoga magazines are no exception, um, to that. And so that is what the general public has seen with respect to yoga. And so they say, oh, that's what yoga is. It's something that, rich middle aged women in leotards practice.
Mm.
And that is problematic because we know that yoga can be practiced by literally any population.
Hmm.
And so that's a big barrier, that we see into that transformation into the mainstream,
Mm.
because the elderly will say, "Well, I can't practice yoga. I'm not thin." And an 18-year-old adolescent boy will say, I don't want to practice yoga. That's for girls."
Mm.
So we have this, mistaken perception of what yoga is and can be.
Mm. Mm. Well, I mean, you also had cited some surveys that you have conducted or you have reviewed, um, why people get into yoga in the first place, and also why do people stay in yoga practices for, let's say, 50 years. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, these are surveys that have been done by my colleagues, and they have asked questions like, "What were your original reasons for?" We did one survey actually in Austin, Texas, and
Hmm.
um, the major reasons why people were signing up to practice yoga were for physical reasons, for physical health, for physical appearance, to some degree for, fixing some kind of, physical problem like a backache or a neck ache or something like that. Next to that is things like stress, and so on.
Hmm.
And then more recent surveys have been done asking the question is, okay, for the long-term practitioners who have been practicing for quite a while, what are their current reasons for practicing yoga? Those were the reasons they started, but why are they continuing to practice yoga? And that becomes very interesting because one of the dominant reasons becomes spirituality.
Hmm.
It becomes stress. So the physical reasons are still there, but to a much less degree. And what has really taken over has been mental health and spirituality.
Hmm.
And so the classic example is someone who says, I've got knee problems, and my neighbor said, I take yoga and help my knee, so I went to a yoga class to fix my knee.
Hmm.
So indeed, 8 weeks later, the knee is better. But hey, during that 8 weeks, I experienced some other stuff.
Hmm.
I got calmer. I felt less stressed. My mood improved. I was less anxious. I was less depressed. And geez, in some of those classes, I experienced this deep sense of peace and inner calm. And boy, that's really valuable to me. And so that's why I'm continuing to practice. So that's the kind of shift that we see. And it goes from this misperception of yoga as being just doing this physical stuff to all of what yoga can do, which encompasses all kinds of human functioning.
Mm. Do you feel, because you've been doing it for 50 years, and I'm gonna keep coming back to that because to me that's really impressive. And then I'll make it personal because I have been the guy that you talked about. I wanted to fix my knee, and I experienced a deep sense of peace and calm, and yet I don't continue to practice. So as someone who's active practitioner for 50 plus years, who was also a teacher, if I understand you correctly, what would you say to someone like me, right, who have experience the deeper benefits of practicing yoga, but who couldn't or haven't rather, who haven't stayed with this beautiful practice? Let's go yoga. What would you say to someone like me?
Well, I mean, I think that's a personal trajectory. That's a personal life course. That's a personal life change. I
Mm-hmm.
think the positive is that you've had an experience which changed your sense of goals in life.
Mm-hmm.
This changed your life purpose and meaning. And you may not have continued with yoga, but you're doing this podcast, which is not it's not about materialistic gain.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is life changing. And whether people continue by meditating or they continue by changing behavior in more non-materialistic ways, that's a permanent change. And some
Mm-hmm.
people will continue with yoga, and some people may switch to qigong or tai chi or martial arts or meditation alone. Mindfulness is very popular. So the important thing is that sort of initial experience that where people get to touch that deeper state of consciousness, that non-everyday state of consciousness that's so difficult to describe, that unitive state. But you
Mm-hmm.
get a taste of that, and that is life changing. So it does change your life trajectory, even though you may not continue to practice.
Well, I'm gonna push you a little bit on that, Sabir, because I would say yes, I have experienced that deeper sense of calm, the unitive state, right? I can't remember exactly what's called pleroma, right? That sense of being in one and almost in a samadhi, enlightenment
Hmm.
state, through many different modalities. But I will say the challenge isn't experiencing that state. It's the effort, it's the work, it's the time that it takes to get there. So for you, someone who's been doing this for 50 years, I am projecting now, inevitably there's a sense of like boredom or like monotony. As humans, we experience that. How were you able to overcome that inner resistance of like, oh man, I'm gonna sit on that cushion again, doing these sub practices? Does that make sense?
Yeah, different people have different levels of engagement. Let me
Hmm.
say that with their yoga tradition, their yoga lineage, their yoga practice, and I'm no different. And some people require some kind of structure, some kind of pressure to keep them practicing, whereas other people, they're not they're not ready to go for the day unless they've got their practice in and they really
Hmm.
love to do their practice. So it's a continuum from one extreme to the other. I actually sit on the non-practice side of extreme,
Mm.
because if I'm not under any pressure or any commitment, I will probably not practice as much. And so I have
Mm.
to put that structure into my week to make sure that I get those practices in. And when I do that, I do experience the benefits of it. But I'm just too lazy or not motivated in that way
Hmm.
to just have my self motivation make that practice happen, whereas other people are.
Mm.
But either way, the more you practice, the more you benefit. That's the truth. That's the reality, and we see that in research studies as well. Those people that practice get the benefit, and if you don't practice, you don't get the benefit. That's the fatal flaw in mind-body medicine. You actually
Hmm.
have to do something, and if you
Well,
don't do it, you
I
don't
would
get it.
say it's yeah, I would say it's not a fatal flaw because you can look at it as a flaw, but I can also look at it as a benefit. I'd say it's
Right.
a hell yes benefit,
Well, of
right?
course, it's a huge benefit because you can do things to change your internal state, both
Mhm.
psychological and physical, without having to resort to surgery and pharmaceuticals and
Mhm.
other technical medical procedures, which most of which don't address the underlying issue. But these practices do address the underlying issues.
Mhm.
And so they're extremely valuable. And when people can comply with the practice and be regular, they'll get the benefit. But one of the problems in modern society is that we've been lulled into modern medicines setup in which the doctor is the one that dictates, what we do, so the responsibility for our own health and our daily well-being is in the hands of, we've given that over to the doctor as opposed to taking it on ourselves. So these days you get headache, you go to the doctor and say, I want a pill for this. And I expect you to give me the pill and I want instant gratification. I want to be good tomorrow. I don't have to do anything. I don't want to have the time. And so just give me the pill. I want to take care of it. And you're responsible. And if you don't give me a good pill, I'm going to complain.
Yeah.
And that kind of an attitude is problematic, as opposed to taking responsibility for your own health on a day-to-day basis.
So you're an expert in the mind body medicine space. So I'll definitely talk more about that. But I want to come back to modifying, hacking one's own behavior a little bit more,
Right.
if you don't mind, because
Right.
you had
Sure.
talked about, especially because you're a practitioner of 50 years, you're also an instructor, right? So I'm sure you've seen students who want to do this, but who couldn't stay with it.
Yeah.
So you said that you apply pressure to yourself. How did you do that? What kind of pressure? Like, are you taking class? Are you putting it on a calendar? Do you put an alarm on your phone? Like, what exactly did you
So
do to
I live,
further you practice?
fortunately, is in a community of
Hmm.
yoga practitioners who are within the same lineage, and we have a daily practice that's been set out in our lineage of practice, and so I set myself up to lead that practice in the morning for a certain number
Mm,
of days per the week, and so that's my sort of structure. I've committed to that, and so when 3:30 in the morning comes up, my alarm is set. I'm up and I'm leading the practice at 4 a.m. 3 days a week, and so that is my structure. But for people who are not part of a spiritual community, there's yoga classes. You set up a yoga class schedule, where it's Tuesday and Thursday nights is your yoga nights, and you go, and you have an interaction with the other people that are there at that class. So it becomes an event. It becomes something that's part of your schedule,
mhm,
and you revere that because it's important to you. So that structure helps you, and it's the group sense that also helps you, because then people say, hey, you missed last week. Where were you? So there's this sense of community and this sense of belonging to a group of people that's practicing, and group practice is very important in yoga.
mm. I love that. I'm actually looking for a Kundalini teacher slash community. So maybe you can help me find someone or some groups near Southern California area.
Yeah,
Um,
well, everything these days is on the internet. So you search Kundalini Yoga or Iyengar Yoga, you type in your city, and boom, there you go. You get 20 hits, and you start going through them, and you find that there's a yoga center a block away from you that's got a class exactly where you want it. So
mm,
it's really much easier than it used to be in the 70s and 80s.
mm, right, right. So 2022, people complaining about they couldn't find communities for someone who's been doing this since the 70s. Let's just be quiet about that.
Yeah, and
Okay.
the 70s, you'd find out about something by walking on the street and seeing a poster up, yoga
Right.
classes here at this yoga center, or on the campus, yoga classes at the campus center, and that's the way you'd find out about it. Or, someone might have put an ad in the university newspaper, or a classified ad in the local paper of yoga classes. That's the way you'd find out.
Yeah. How important it is, because you had mentioned it earlier, how the spirituality component. Now you are at you're a really interesting person to talk to, because you are not only a professional researcher, where it's all about data, but you're also a practitioner of these type of spiritual practices. So if you don't mind delineating and unpacking, what is the separation between spirituality? Well, number one, what is spirituality to you? How do you define it? And also number
Right.
two, how do you distinguish um, the rigor of science as well as spirituality?
So spirituality it's a little difficult to define, but
Hmm.
I would say the number one characteristic of spirituality is it's an experience.
Hmm.
Okay, and that distinguishes it from something that it's often confused with, which is religiosity. and belonging to a religion, because religions are based upon essentially dogma and belief, whereas spirituality is an experience. So it's an experience, and the best way to describe that sort of experience is to use adjectives that somehow sort of bring you to that experience. So the most powerful word is unity. There's a sense of this experience in the universe as a oneness. And that is probably the most fundamental description of it. There's a sense of oneness. There's a sense of feeling the universe as one, feeling at one with everything. And then other associations with that are, terms that I've used in this presentation of peace, calmness, and that is also associated with a number of other positive psychological states, with kindness, with compassion. And there's a sense of ease, there's a sense of calm, there's a sense of joy, there's a sense of gratitude. These are all positive psychological emotions and states that go along with that experience. But the core of the experience is that deep, penetrating sense of experiencing all of the universe as a oneness. And that is the core of that experience. Now, people may not experience the full depth of that. It's been called, in philosophy, it's called the mystical experience. And there's a whole field of philosophy called mysticism that really talks about that state of consciousness. You may not experience that full-blown mystical state of transcendence, but you'll get close to it and have some of those related experiences, like the calm and the peace. So that's kind of what I would describe as the core of spirituality. Now, in terms of being a scientist, I mean, that's a personal choice. That's a personal career choice. I've always been interested, even as a child, in science. And so, that's what I studied in university. And then when I got turned on to yoga, I shifted my interest in science towards yoga, saying, geez, this is a great experience. It deserves to be researched. And so that's when I set a goal of wanting to do research on yoga. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the research that you're capable of doing has to be funded. And so you can only do what you can get funded, really. If you're really a conventional scientist running a laboratory. So that's what I had to do. And so I ended up running what is more easily funded, which is clinical trials of yoga for things like mental health states, like anxiety, like insomnia, like post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, you can hope to be on, working a little bit on the side of working on the spirituality component. I mean, there is research on spirituality with yoga, but it's a very small area within the field of yoga research. But so for me, when I was able to finally get funded to do this work, it was really the amalgamation of both my personal life and my professional life as being all centered on yoga.
Well, I mean, I have a two-part. Let's see. And I'm trying to make a creative choice in my mind right now. So, at what point? Because in my mind, spirituality is this experience that you talked about, and science. I'm a PhD scientist as well, so it's about quantifying, measuring, reducing, things based on specific measurements, and at the surface it looks paradoxical. How do you measure something that's holistic, that's that's spiritual in nature, but the nature of science is to quantify things, to reduce things, so we can actually just see some kind of a trend line. So in my mind, it's fascinating that you're a yoga researcher, right? So how do you quantify certain this mystical experience that is so hard to quantify? If you don't mind sort of sharing the framework of how you do that, that would be really
so
educational.
much of the work that I've done, the interventions that we've done are not long enough and intense enough to really generate these sort of deeper changes. They may, in a few participants, have those changes, but for the most part, you're working on treating insomnia, improving their insomnia.
Hmm.
And science is interesting because you get to learn about the mechanisms. How much is breath regulation changing our stress systems to reduce the overall stress response to allow sleep to happen more deeply? I mean, those are the kinds of scientific questions that we're asking, and we can measure that through the EEG. We can measure through that through blood samples. We can measure that in many different ways and quantify it and determine how much the physical postures are making that effect, or how much the meditation is contributing to that. And so there's a lot to learn about that aspect of yoga. But if you want to study the spiritual aspects of yoga, that is now requiring a different set of tools.
Hmm.
And, I've heard many people say, well, you can't possibly study spirituality. It's impossible to study yoga. Science can't study yoga. And I disagree with that.
Mm.
As long as you can describe an experience, you can study it. And of course, in the field of mental health, most everything that's measured is actually by self-report. I mean,
Hmm.
there are no blood sample measures that you can say quantifies whether someone has depression or not, or
Hmm.
whether someone has an anxiety disorder. These are done by questionnaires and by interviews, by people describing their experiences. So that is the whole field of psychiatry and psychology is based upon that kind of self-reporting.
Hmm.
Now, studying spirituality is the same kind of thing. To what degree did you have that unitive state? To what degree did you have an experience of calmness on a scale of 1 to 10? And you can make up a questionnaire and an instrument that will measure someone's spiritual experience. There's a mysticism scale. There are transcendence scales that have already been validated by a number of researchers. And so you can apply these questionnaires as instruments to measure those changes. And it
Mm.
is possible to do that. Now, there are some other areas that in modern science are really starting to be applicable as well. So neuroimaging is really one area that has a huge potential in this realm. We're able to study people meditating in the scanner, in the brain scanner, and we can see which areas of the brain are being activated during the meditation process. So we can see the more mundane changes that occur. So, for example, the focus of attention in meditation, we see the attention networks of the brain being activated, and they're inhibiting the emotional brain or the limbic system. And so we see those mundane things, but we can also see when people report, that they have a deeper experience in the scanner. We can see which areas of the brain or which networks in the brain are being activated. So we can start to understand the neurophysiology of these experiences. In a related area of research, we know that hallucinogens, a number of hallucinogens, will generate these mystical states.
Hmm.
And this happens in about 40% of people that take hallucinogens in the experiments that have been conducted. And these people experience these mystical states. And so now we've got that research, and that research can also look in terms of which regions of the brain are being stimulated by these particular hallucinogenic agents that happen to trigger these same regions of the brain that are triggered when we do these meditative contemplative practices.
Mm. Is so that was gonna be my next question. So for you, you had alluded to earlier, you research what you can fund it for, right? Assuming you can fund it for whatever it is that you want to do research upon, what are the area of research that you really wanted to research?
Well, the reason I wanted to do research in the first place was to study these altered states of consciousness.
Mm.
But you know, there's no one who is going to fund that in the 80s or the 90s.
Hmm.
It just was not going to happen. I mean, in fact, even mundane yoga research was not going to get funded. I was fortunate enough that my first grant was a funding from the National Institutes of Health
Hmm.
to study the effects of yoga for chronic insomnia. And I think that if you had applied a grant to try and study spiritual states at that point in time, you would not have been able to get a grant. I mean, and probably still you would not be able to get a grant. It would be very challenging to get a grant on that topic because most of the grants are really funded for practical reasons. I mean,
Hmm.
substantial fraction of the population is suffering from mental health problems. And of course, a lot of the funding is geared towards practical applications. Now, I would consider spirituality to be very important, but you'd have to convince the reviewers of those grants, who are other conventional scientists, that this is worthy of study.
Hmm.
So despite the fact that we have organizations like the World Health Organization, who says that spirituality is an important thing to humans in life, trying to convince a study section who are comprised of the reviewers for these grants is going to be, at this point in time, still somewhat difficult.
Do you see that changing anytime soon? Especially now we have new mechanisms where crowdfunding or crypto mechanisms were allowed crowds to support a thing. Do you
I
see
have
that
not,
happening anytime soon?
yeah, I have not seen, and I have not heard of any colleagues who have been funded that way. The problem is that it's like an all or nothing situation here.
Hmm.
When we get a grant from the National Institutes of Health, it pays for our salary, it pays for the salary of our staff, including the
Hmm.
postdoctoral fellow, the graduate student, the research assistant. Um, it pays for the laboratory space. It pays for the costs of the study in terms of the assays
Hmm.
and all the other costs that are involved. So when we're talking about funding for a study, a pilot study from the National Institutes of Health is like, $450,000 in direct costs.
Hmm.
And then your institution gets, a substantial fraction of that. So it ends up being just under $1 million just for a pilot study for 3 years.
Hmm.
And if you're talking about a full 5 year study, at the NIH level, you're talking about $1.5 million. Now, you're not going to get that from crowdfunding, and you're unlikely to get that from a wealthy donor. And so, when you talk about funding from sort of donors and lower level funding, like from the state level and so on, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars, and that is marginal support,
Hmm.
and really not sufficient to really allow you to get deep into a study. So this is the problem. Research is extremely expensive, and the reason it's extremely expensive is you're paying people salaries,
Hmm.
and it's not just their salaries; it's benefits as well, fringe
Hmm.
benefits. It's salary plus the fringe benefits. This is a huge cost, and it's 90% of the cost of research study.
Hmm. 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 Yeah, thanks for getting into the details. As a former researcher, I feel your pain. I understand. I used to write funding proposals to NIH, to NSF, and I get the grapple, the struggle. So thank you
Yeah,
for
and
sharing.
it's a struggle, as you know. I mean, these days it's you write 10 grant applications and you expect to get one out of that. And so
Hmm.
that's an enormous amount of effort on an ongoing basis for work that leads to nothing. I
Hmm.
mean, you can then revise those applications and use what you've done before, but all of that work goes for nothing because the grant is not accepted. So it's a challenge to keep yourself funded as a researcher, and that certainly goes for conventional science. And I would argue that it's probably a little bit more taxing for those of us who are in quote unquote more fringe areas like yoga.
Mm. Well, actually, let me ask you this question because uh, just in terms of researchers and media savviness, you might I would consider to be quite media savvy, as in you're talking to the communities, you are doing podcast interviews like this, reaching out. You're not just staying in a quote unquote ivory tower and speaking
Right.
to researchers only, right? So as someone who is active in the community, who also has new other jobs like being the director of these research centers outside of the academic institutes, how has being media savvy helped uh, you with your research endeavors?
Well, I can't say that it has really helped that much. It's helped in marginal ways, perhaps, but when it comes down to the bottom line as to
Mm,
whether did you get that $1 million grant or did you not get that $1 million grant, and will you be funded for 5 years or will you not be funded and be out of a job?
mhm,
That reputation, that media savvy, that being out in the public really doesn't play into that. It's
Mm,
your grant application, it's what you've done, it's what the ideas you're presenting, what the proposal is, and the details of that proposal, and can you convince the reviewers in that study section, in that collection of reviewers, to fund the grant. And so that doesn't play into that, but there are indirect effects, and those indirect effects are to promote, um, for those of us who are yoga researchers, we believe in yoga. We believe it has a lot of value, and so we're dedicated to promoting yoga in general. We're dedicated to promoting the use of yoga in our modern institutions, into healthcare, for example, uh, because we think there's a very significant value to it. Yoga is providing something that modern medicine does not have and probably will never have, based upon the way it's set up right now. So, um, you know, our presence in the media and in the public, and when we give talks and so on, it's really a service. It does help with the reputation. You get invited, and if people see you, then you get invited to present somewhere else. Um, so there are indirect things that happen. So, for example, you'll get invited because you published a paper. You'll get invited to talk at some institution in some department, and then you'll strike up a conversation with someone who has an interest in what you're doing, and suddenly there's a collaboration that develops out of that because you had the opportunity to show your work and share that and then talk about it. You'd end up developing a collaboration, which could lead to a grant application, which could lead to funding. So there are secondary outcomes that occur from being out in the public, that are important, that can contribute in an indirect way to the bottom line, which is getting your grant and running your study.
I appreciate your public service. Thank you so much again for being on the Warrior. um, so let's see, where could we go from here? Mm, I had a question and I lost it. Man, um, give me a moment. Um, okay, so so you have been doing this for a long time. Oh, actually, I have a question for you. So there are wearables that helps us track these type
Mhm.
of data inherently. It may not necessarily be as good for research purposes, but are you paying attention to wearables helping you also track certain data while doing the postures, the asanas, the meditations, beyond the neuroimaging that you talked about, beyond molecular neurotransmitter collection, blood sample collection? Is there anything that you're excited about that you're paying attention to?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened with the pandemic is the use of virtual interventions. Because of the pandemic, I mean, there were studies that suddenly were discontinued because you couldn't bring people into the laboratory. And so the whole idea of virtual interventions and virtual data collection has been going on for a little while now, because of, people can complete their questionnaires and their self-report measures online. And then download that data, and that's the same, and probably even better than having them come into a laboratory, sit down with a pencil and paper and spend an hour filling out the questionnaires in your lab. So that whole aspect has improved. That whole digital aspect of it has improved. In terms of the wearables, I mean, depending upon the field of research that you're involved in, we've always had wearables. I mean, except that those wearables were under laboratory conditions. So, for example, if you're measuring heart rate variability, you bring someone in, you put on formal EKG sensors, and you measure very precisely the EKG, and that gives you have very sophisticated software that does analysis on that. So now there's wearables that claim that they can do heart rate variability analysis. Well, yes and no. Um, it's it's much more variable. It's not as precise, and you lose a lot of precision. Whenever you lose precision, that deteriorates your data. And
Hmm.
so now you have to rely upon getting more data to try and overcome that lack of precision. So the wearables are good up to a certain point, and they're only relevant depending upon what field you're interested in. So if you're interested in studying depression, anxiety, and trauma, they don't, there's nothing there. I mean, heart rate's not going to change that much. Heart rate variability may have some changes because you can derive from that a measure of the stress response system, but it really depends upon what you're studying. So wearables, for example, for blood pressure, for hypertension, yeah, absolutely. That is something that you can now have a wearable thing, and an automatic blood pressure cuff can then do 10 blood pressure measurements over the course of the day, and you can follow a subject in a study with that. But it's only relevant to certain particular conditions or populations.
Yeah, I remember what was the question I wanted to ask. Thank you so much for your patience. So you had mentioned that yoga research is fringe based on your perspective. How did you choose yoga research as your path? Even though knowing that it's a fringe area of research, even though it's hard to get research funding in that area,
Right,
how did you
right.
come to that conclusion? How did you choose that dharmic path
Well,
effectively?
when I came to this decision of wanting to do research on yoga, I was in my early 20s, and when you're in your early 20s, you're indestructible. I mean, uh, you know, I recall meeting with the chair of the Department of Physiology where I was at in terms of finding a graduate mentor. And my ultimate goal was to study yoga, but in the short term, I had to get a PhD in some conventional field of science, and so
Mhm,
that's what I was looking for in terms of a neurophysiology laboratory that I could study in. I
mhm,
happened to meet with the chair of the department, and I said, I'm interested in working on neurophysiology. I understand you're working in this particular field, and so on, and just wanted to talk to you about what goes on your lab and whether you've got openings for graduate students and so on and so forth. And during the course of that interview, he asked me, he said, "So what is your ultimate long-term goal?" And I kind of let it out. And I said, well, I'm interested in studying these altered states of consciousness in yoga practice. And he said very bluntly, well, basically, if that's your goal, I advise you not to go into science and research at all,
mm,
period. Now, again, as I said, I was in my early 20s. That was like water off a duck. I mean, it just, I, I, I didn't care. I was going to go forward, and I found another mentor. I didn't talk much about my yoga interest, but it was there. And I was not able to do research on yoga until there was actual funding from the National Institutes of Health targeted at integrative medicine. And that didn't happen until the formation of the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which is now called the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, way back in the year 2000. And so I set the goal of wanting to do research in 1975. I didn't
mm,
start doing research on yoga until 2001. That's
mhm,
25 years uh, without being able to do what my primary passion was. I mean, of course,
mhm,
I enjoyed doing the research that I was doing for that 25 years. I was learning skills, I was enjoying the science, but it wasn't my primary interest.
mm.
So that is an example of what was available at that time, and it just was not fundable. It was just not available. But since 2000 in the U.S., it has become more fundable, and so it's much different than it was.
So how did you keep going, knowing that you just trusted that eventually there would be research centers open up to help you, do this type of research that you're
Well, I
ultimately
had no
doing?
guarantee that I would ever be able to do research on yoga. There were no guarantees that I could ever do that work. I mean, I was
Mhm,
happy being a scientist,
mhm,
having a career and studying things that were of interest. It was a good job. I mean, academia, it brings you into the forefront of modern knowledge, and so
mm,
being an academic is a very rewarding experience because you're on the cutting edge of human knowledge, and it's exciting, and so it is a good field. There are negatives to it. The grant writing is the one we
Yep.
talked about.
Yep.
Publish or perish, and that goes along with, with the grants. So there are challenges in that career, but there's an enormous amount of freedom in that career as well. So I mean, it's not a bad career. I enjoyed my science that I was studying, and I was involved in it. And it's just a question of whether I was able ever to engage in my primary passion, which fortunately I was able to. These days, it's very different from young people who are in their early 20s and say, I want to do research on yoga. There are mentors out there who they could study under, and there is funding out there that is targeted in this area. So it's now feasible, much more feasible to do it now than it was when I was coming up.
Mm. So ultimately, you had said that you want to study the altered states of consciousness during yoga practice. Yeah. So let's just dream right now. How would you design such an experiment such that you can measure altered states of consciousness during yoga
Well, it's
practice?
interesting that you say that because I'm sort of semi-retired right now, and I'm no longer running studies out of my laboratory and no
Oh,
longer writing grants.
oh.
So now I'm still involved in research, but only as sort of a co-investigator,
Mm,
as a consultant, and I'm still lecturing, and I'm still, we run the annual Symposium on Yoga Research. I'm still the editor in chief of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, so I'm still very actively involved in research in many ways. I do a lot of lecturing still, traveling to conferences. And so I'm still very much involved in research. But in terms of, that spirituality, we are actually considering doing some survey studies that
mm,
address this whole idea of spirituality and spiritual experiences that yoga practitioners have.
mm,
And so I'd like to quantify those changes and start doing some research specifically in that area.
mhm,
There are some simple questions to ask. How much yoga does it take before you have to have these experiences? How
mhm,
regularly do you have to practice? How long do you have to practice? How many months? What's the percentage of people that experience this? Are there certain personality types that are more likely to experience these states of consciousness than others? Is it dependent upon race? Is it dependent upon culture? Is it dependent upon your family? Is it dependent upon your education? What are the factors that determine whether you have these transcendent experiences? So there's a lot of questions that can be asked in this particular area, and so I'm sort of looking towards designing and perhaps conducting some humble studies in that direction.
Oh, I love it. So, if you don't mind, let's drill in on that a little bit more because I'm thinking like, how would you do that, right?
Right.
So, because since yoga is a series of postures and meditation and all those things combined, the four components that you talked about, do you ask them during? Do you ask them before and after? How would you ask this
Sure.
such
I
a
mean,
subjective
yeah, you
question?
could. I mean, so there's a number of ways you could do this. I mean, so for example, there are teacher training programs. People who've been practicing
Mm,
yoga for a few months or a year, and then they say, well, geez, this is now important to me. This is part of my life. I'm going to
mhm,
become a teacher.
mhm,
So we now have many, many, many different lineages of yoga who all have teacher training programs. And these are
mhm,
intensive yoga practice programs as well as learning how to teach programs. And so when you go into a teacher training program, you are engaging in a good deal of practice and involvement with yoga practice. So what we can
mhm,
do is we can study people who go into a teacher training program. We can monitor their day-to-day experiences of transcendental states. To what degree are they experiencing positive psychological states in their day-to-day lives? And then get to them at the end of the teacher training program and ask the same questions.
mhm,
So we might see that someone reports on the sense of peace and calm before the teacher training program is 6 out of 10. And then by the end of the teacher training program, they're scoring 8 out of 10.
mhm.
So we've seen that the teacher training programs have generated more of these positive psychological states, and you can ask the same questions about transcendental experiences, et cetera, et cetera. So it's basic psychological research.
Mm. Now, let's do a side by side comparison because right now there's they call it renaissance of psychedelics research again,
Yeah.
right? So since you're interested in studying the altered state of consciousness during yoga practices, and there's a resurgence of psychedelic research, whatever the medicine may be, is there any parallel? Is there any how do I ask this question? Is there any parallel that you see? Is there any reinvigoration of excitement that, hey, there's another area of research that's getting a lot of media attention right now? Is there any
Yeah,
parallel?
and it is, the work on hallucinogens is getting a lot of attention because hallucinogens are now starting to be considered for treatment of specific mental health conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that a whole new field of research, which is then related to hallucinogens, which is not tied together with the whole idea of spirituality. But I see that field as very interesting because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the results that they're finding are very relevant to what we're finding. I believe that hallucinogens trigger the same regions or the same networks in the brain
Mm-hmm.
that these contemplative practices address. And so there's a lot of relevance there to look at what's going on in that field, and see how the changes in contemplative practices are making similar changes. So to me, it's a supportive related field.
Beautiful. Um, hmm. And then how would you so since you're an editor in a publication, is there any sort of comparison studies that you can make from yoga practice to psychedelic research at all?
I'm a little hesitant to go into psychedelics myself. I think that there's some concern about those from a spiritual perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that has been suggested has been that if you consistently use these hallucinogens, you are artificially stimulating those regions of the brain. And you may potentially be then um, negating the possibility that you could trigger those regions of the brain with contemplative practices. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, you wear those regions out, or you blow them out, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're no longer able to achieve those states through contemplative practices. I'm very much focused on the idea that these experiences really are most valuable if they come from spiritual practices, from meditation, from breathing techniques. To me, that is of most value.
Got it. Beautiful. I I appreciate that perspective. Yeah. I think there should be research done in that area specifically, right? Whether or not endogenous is exogenous production of such stimulants or such stimulation rather is would actually cause irreversible harm to whatever the mechanism that produces such a biochemistry. So I think it would be quite interesting.
Difficult to quantify that, but it would be an interesting study. I agree.
Yeah. Um, so going back to my body medicine. So you had talked about yoga as in four components: the postures, the relaxation, the meditation, and what was the fourth?
The breathing, the pranayama.
Breathing. Thank you. Yes, the breathing. So since science is about the ability to reproduce results, so I'm quite curious to know because people like me will want to know. So what are some of the most effective ways? So what are some of the most persistent way to have results in relaxation and addressing anxiety and so forth? Do you have any answers to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the and if and I have to be cautious here because I'm speaking in generalities, and there's always
Sure,
exceptions to generalities.
of
And so,
course.
you make a generalization, and people say, "Well, I just met someone who, violates that." So I'm speaking in very
Mhm.
much generalizations. So one generalization that I stand by is that a yoga intervention or a yoga lineage or yoga practice
Mhm,
that incorporates all four of those components, perhaps plus others like diet, like
mhm,
philosophy, like group sangat, um,
mhm.
those more traditional, comprehensive, multi-component practices are likely to yield more benefit, more change, more improvement, and even more spirituality than more limited practices, which focus heavily on one or the other.
Mm.
So comparing a traditional yoga format with a yoga class that does nothing but asanas, no meditation, no breathing, no relaxation, or comparing it to meditation alone, where there's no breathing, no posture, no relaxation. My contention is that you're better off with the multi-component practice. It's likely to be more effective for several reasons. One is that you are affecting the same mechanisms through all four of those different components. You're affecting the stress system through the physical postures, through the breathing, through the relaxation, through the meditation. You put them all together and you're more likely to have a stronger impact. That's one aspect, is that you're coming at it from more angles. And so the more angles you come at it from, the more success you're likely to have. The second aspect to this is when someone starts out with yoga practices with the four different components, they now have an opportunity to gravitate to what they personally benefit most from. So someone may begin with a yoga class and then find that they are deeply inspired and deeply moved by the meditation practices, so that they can then emphasize the meditation practice. Or other people may emphasize the physical component or the breathing component. Had they not been presented with the full comprehensive yoga in the beginning, they would not have been able to sort of gravitate towards the style that fits them. So, for example, in the case of someone who really got turned on by meditation, if that person was presented with just a physical yoga practice alone, they never would have identified that potential passion and engagement with meditation. So that's the second reason why I think that so this multi-component traditional yoga is better than what I've termed is limited yoga, in which the focus is heavily or entirely on one aspect of the yoga.
So, as a Kundalini teacher, but also a practitioner, I'm curious: are there any specific kind of lineage or teachers or places that we can introduce people to this multi-faceted approach to yoga?
Well, I mean, the different yoga lineages all have their levels of emphasis on those different aspects of yoga. Some yoga lineages are more focused on the physical, and some are more focused on the spiritual. I would say that Kundalini Yoga is very much a spiritual form of yoga practice. The goal is really spiritual development.
Mm.
It's not as much focused on body alignment and so on. That is there, of course, just because it is, a physical component of yoga. But the focus is really personal growth. And there are other yoga lineages which also have a similar focus on that spiritual advancement component. And so anyone that wants to engage in a yoga practice, I mean, they have to determine, what their interest is. I mean, is their interest in getting physically fit, or is their interest in spiritual development? And that they can then use that interest to try and map an appropriate yoga teacher, an appropriate yoga style to meet that interest. Fortunately, we have the internet today, so it's easy to do that shopping. You can, find out about, the different lineages and all the details, and you can even try online classes for that matter. And it's not just about the yoga lineage, it's also about the individual teacher, because two teachers from the same yoga lineage will give you a very different experience. And that's personality issues, that's different teaching styles. And so that plays into this as well. But it is a major issue about how people engage in a yoga practice. So at Harvard Medical School, the faculty has dictated that all first-year medical students need to go through a resiliency training program in which they're exposed to many different types of mind-body practices. So I find myself teaching yoga to several groups of first-year medical students. I talk to them about the science behind it. I take them through a chair yoga practice, and right there in the lecture hall, in which they can sort of experience some deep breathing and meditation. And then I spend a lot of time talking about how to select an appropriate yoga style and practice.
Oh.
And this is extremely important, because if you don't find a practice that fits you, you will not engage in it. If you don't engage in
Mhm.
it, it's you don't engage in
You
it. It
won't
doesn't
benefit
happen.
from it. Yeah, for
And
sure.
so there's many people walking around, and you say, "Have you ever tried yoga?" You say, "Yeah, I tried yoga once." Well,
Mhm.
what do you mean once? What did you do? What did you practice?
Mhm.
And to, that immediately is a clue that tells you that person really did not investigate the opportunities in yoga.
Mhm.
And that's extremely important, because if you don't find a yoga lineage or practice, school, or a teacher that fits your personality and your needs, you will not engage in that practice.
Okay.
So it's got to be tailored, and the only way you tailor it is that you have to shop. And it's like buying a car. You just don't walk down the street, come to a used car shop, and the dealer says, "Buy this car." You buy that car. Nobody does that. You go
Mhm.
online, you shop for all the cars, you look at the different makes, you look at their mileage, you look at their repair records, you look at their comfort, how much can they carry, and then you go to the different shops, you drive the cars, and then you look at the prices, and you look at the different dealerships, and then after all of that work, I'm going to buy this car. And then when you've done that, you're satisfied with your purchase. You have to do the same with yoga.
Mhm.
You have to identify what is it that you want out of yoga. You have to go online and find out what the different styles of yoga are, match that up, and then you've got to go and take multiple classes from different studios and different teachers.
Mm.
Once you've done that, you can then finally say, I'm going to settle on this teacher in this studio.
Mm.
And once you've done that, you are much more likely to engage in a regular basis with that practice. And that avoids this whole situation where you just end up in some strange yoga class out of the blue, and then it doesn't fit, and you say, I tried yoga once.
Yeah. And it's very similar to dating as well. You don't just meet someone and say, "All right, you're it."
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I would underline something that you mentioned, because a huge part of yoga practice is based on your personal preference, what you're looking for. But I
Absolutely.
would assert that perhaps they don't even know what they're looking for. Perhaps they
Until
don't
you
even know how.
experience it, until you're in that studio with that teacher, you may
Mhm.
have preconceptions about what that teacher is going to teach and what you're going to experience.
Mhm.
But 9 times out of 10, it's not what you thought.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that is particularly true with yoga, especially with this reputation of yoga being, acrobatic Gumby postures for women.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Um, well, we haven't talked about your expertise of the mind-body intervention. I know we touched on it a little bit earlier. Would you like to say some more about how modern medicine is about addressing the mind or the body versus yoga, which is focusing on the mind-body intervention together? Would you say more about that?
Yeah, sure. And the term mind body says it all. In the 1800s, modern medicine at that time went through a sort of a transition. It separated the mind and the body into psychology, psychiatry, and physical medicine. And that separation is there to this day. And it really dominates our medical and psychological system. So the psychiatrist never asks about physical characteristics. And the internal medicine person never or rarely asks about mental health issues and stresses. It's starting to change a little bit, but largely physical medicine is focused on the physical body, and psychology and psychiatric medicine are focused on mental, and the two shall never meet, right? It's just like we're two separate entities, and that is completely untrue. Everything that's manifested psychologically is manifested in the body, and vice versa. We are we are mind-body entities. And to treat something without referring to the other aspects that are going on in the individual is being very superficial. So to treat someone with type 2 diabetes, the physical medicine approach is this is a case of glucose dysregulation. And so that's how it's treated, like a mechanism. And there's no sense of behavior involvement. There's no sense of stress. There's no sense of mood disturbance. And yet we know that people with type 2 diabetes that have higher levels of stress, they have sleep disturbance, and they have certain eating behaviors that they cannot get out of. And those are psychological characteristics, but they're often not dealt with. And that's because of this sort of schism in modern medicine between just body only or mind only. The beauty of yoga, it's a mind-body practice. It addresses both issues. And so that's the virtue of yoga in terms of how it is different from a lot of approaches in modern medicine. And another misconception in modern medicine is referring to the biggest burden in modern medicine, which is the so-called non-communicable diseases. These are lifestyle-related diseases, things like hypertension, like diabetes, obesity, depression. These are largely due to lifestyle behaviors. Despite that, modern medicine is treating these with pharmaceuticals and surgeries and other technological approaches, which tend to focus on the symptoms of the disorder rather than the underlying causes. Because they're lifestyle diseases, it's the lifestyle behaviors that are the risk factors for these diseases. And the major risk factors are low levels of physical activity, poor dietary choices, dysfunctional health behaviors like smoking and excessive alcohol consumption, and the inability to manage chronic stress. And those factors, there's no pill for those.
Mm-hmm.
There's no surgery for those. Those are behavioral issues. So if you really want to change a lifestyle disorder, you have to change lifestyle. Modern medicine is not focused on changing lifestyle. It's focused on changing symptoms. Here's the pill for your type 2 diabetes. So yoga provides an opportunity to actually make changes in lifestyle behavior. And these come about because yoga is extremely good at reducing chronic stress, which is part of that whole risk factor grouping. It can improve physical activity because it includes physical activity. And very importantly, through the meditative component, it's increasing mind-body awareness, mind-body sensitivity. And that is a vehicle for behavior change, lifestyle change. When you become more sensitive to your body, you no longer want to do those things that are unhealthy for you because you experience that negative experience from that unhealthy behavior. And you gravitate towards healthy behaviors like exercise because now you're more sensitive to the positive benefits of those activities. So yoga actually has a number of elements that are actually very good at lifestyle change. Mm-hmm. And there, as I said, in modern medicine, there is no pill for lifestyle change.
So on that note, good question there, Sabir, because you're speaking to the converted, right? I get it. Yoga is a multidimensional solution to a lifestyle issue, right? A disease. So, and if people take this on, they're going to benefit in multidimensional ways, mind, body, heart, and spirit, all that, right? So as an educator, as a practitioner, as a teacher, as an evangelist, what do you see is the biggest barrier for people adapting to this solution that's known to be super, super helpful?
Well, it's education. It's really education, and that's educating the public, and it's educating the healthcare providers. Educating the healthcare providers means that you have to do research. It's the research that's going to document that yoga has these benefits, that actually will get yoga taught into the medical schools, that will generate the meta-analyses and the reviews and the consensus statements around yoga practice that the physicians and clinicians will read and respect. And so that's educating the healthcare providers, but it's also educating the public. And that will come partially through the medical system once doctors are on board, but it can also come through these kinds of podcasts, lectures, newspaper articles in which the research is described. A paper was just published in this premier journal showing that yoga does this or that. We had a paper published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry, a major medical journal, showing that yoga had strong benefit for generalized anxiety disorder. That gets picked up by the media, and then that hopefully it's on Good Morning America someday, and suddenly people are seeing that, hey, yoga has been shown to do this or that for this particular condition. So it's education. It's getting yoga out there. It's getting that proof of evidence to the doctors and to the public, and it's also educating the public that yoga is not just for thin middle-aged women in leotards.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So, well, uh, I so appreciate you taking the time being a noble warrior out of your very busy schedule, out of your research, out of your evangelism to just educating people about the benefit of yoga. Is there anything that you think I should have been asking, but I didn't ask at all? Is there any last thing that you wanted to say for someone who's listening to this conversation?
No, I think we covered it all. And I think, some of the more important parts, and one of the questions I get most often is, how do I get into a yoga practice? And we touched on that, and the whole idea of really shopping and looking for the practice that fits for you. You will be able to find a practice and a teacher that really gives you a very powerful experience that can change your life. And that change in life can be life-saving. Many people who practice yoga over time with regular practice will say this exact phrase, and for some reason it's exactly the same phrase. People will say, yoga changed my life. And they'll say it exactly like that because they've gone through that transformation. They've gone through those experiences and that change. And I've actually heard people say, yoga saved my life, especially
Mm,
people who were deeply into some disorder like addiction or trauma, in which yoga was very helpful. So that's really the most important part. It's practice, and practice means engaging in something in a way that gives you a regularity, and that regularity is what's going to sustain you and give you the benefits.
mm. Well, Noble Warrior is all about living a life of deep joy and purpose and meaning. And what you just said beautifully wraps up what ultimately brings that forth is that regular practice and persistence and keep doing the discipline that's going to bring us whatever physical, mental, spiritual, emotional benefit out of that. So thank you so much, Sabir, for sharing your wisdom. As a practitioner of 50 years, that is it just in itself just shuts up the room. I would assert. So thank you for the work that you do.
My pleasure to be with you and all of you.
Appreciate it. Let me end broadcast. 1 second.